Hey everyone, welcome to today's video where we're going to have a look at AMD stock. Before we look at the Excel sheet for the Q2 earnings report, which are going to come in a couple of weeks from now, I'd like to look at the news that has been coming in over the past 24 hours, mainly the easing of the trade war between the United States and China, at least when it comes to the semiconductors, specifically on the AI GPU front, where the companies like AMD and, to be fair, Nvidia has had some limitations in terms of export control, but we can see that AMD is not going to be able to sell the MI308 chip AI GPU to China. I'd expect this to bring in quite high margin and significant revenue for AMD. I mean, the numbers out there are speaking about 1.5 billion, and that is quite substantial for AMD. I would argue that is almost an entire quarter's worth of AI GPU sales for AMD. You could argue also that this is quite high margin revenue. Additionally, I'd expect that Nvidia is currently been selling out everywhere they can. This would potentially open up a place where, due to the lack of Nvidia supply, maybe AMD is gonna actually take more market share, because we know there's an ocean of demand also in China. They are like looking everywhere to try to satisfy that demand, right? So I would say that there is a there's a take here in which AMD will actually get more benefit from this in relation to Nvidia, due to the fact that Nvidia is probably more closer to being like outsold, whereas AMD has had somewhat of a difficulty to especially sell out the MI325X. Remember, MI325X is the successor to the MI300, which was launched in December of 2023. We've also seen this very interesting post from Mark Zuckerberg. I think he's talking about the path to the super intelligence effort, and in which they are going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars into compute to build super intelligence. He mentions that they have the capital from their business to do this, and also that the essentially super clusters that are going to be online in 2026 is going to be well above 1 gigawatt hour data centers. And just to put it into relation to the biggest ones out there right now, I think they are in the 100 to 200 megawatt. So this one is going to be multiple times larger than the previous clusters. I would actually say this is super bullish for Nvidia and AMD, and of course others like Broadcom and probably a bunch of other semiconductor stocks, but specifically also for AMD, because again, we have to be honest that the story over the past 2 years has been that Nvidia saw this coming. They acted well ahead of everyone else, and also Nvidia actually worked on this specific thing when it comes to connecting big number of AI GPUs together. Remember, you can have the best GPU. In fact, we have seen that probably on a chip-to-chip basis, AMD is super competitive. I mean, you could argue that already back in 2024, MI300 was very competitive with H100 and H200 from Nvidia. The problem has always been that once you connect them into the 10, 100 or tens of thousands of GPUs, then you start to see the limitations of AMD's communication and networking, and where Nvidia with the Mellanox purchase a couple of years ago is starting to run away with it. Even though if Nvidia might not have actually the pure design wise the best chip out there, but once they connect them together, it's just a different game. So sure, if you are doing some AI modeling, small scale language models, you could do fine with AMD. But the likes of Facebook, Microsoft, Google, I mean Grok from XAI, all these like super large models, like the frontier kind of models, those are like in the tens of thousands, and starting recently also, especially with the Colossus, which is XAI's cluster, getting into the hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of GPUs connected together. That's somewhere that to date AMD cannot compete with Nvidia. That's going to be changed, especially with the MI400 next year. So again, I know that this is kind of a little bit of a broken record, because I was expecting, and we have to hold up our hands up there, that most of AMD bulls expected this already by this year. But I would say we have seen that although AMD will sell quite a lot of AI GPUs in 2025, so, don't forget that in 2024 they sold around 5 billion. This year they're expected to sell around, let's say, anywhere between 7 to maybe 9.5 billion. That's a substantial, like 50 to 80% increase year over year. And it's also in line with the AMD CFO said a couple of quarters ago, or maybe last quarter, in which she mentioned that they expect high double-digit growth year on year when it comes to AI GPU sales. But in any case, I'm looking at the numbers out there, and if you look at this statement from Mark Zuckerberg, and remember this is only Meta and Facebook, then we've got Microsoft, Google, XAI, and all these other companies out there. So a ton of money is going to be invested here, and not all of them is going to go to Nvidia, and increasingly so Nvidia's advantage is not going to be quite as clear as it's been from 2023, and then last year in 2024, and now in 2025. I think with every single year that goes, AMD gets a little bit closer to Nvidia. The biggest, I guess, bottleneck has still been, the communication, the connectivity, how to connect, multiple tens of thousands of GPUs together, as I mentioned earlier in the video. That is something that AMD will tackle next year much more seriously. But until then, it's going to be, sporadically some kind of, for AMD's kind of scale, quite large orders from potentially Facebook or Meta. And then obviously we all remember that a couple of months ago, the one from Oracle talking about 30,000 MI355Xs in a single cluster. So there's always, big wins for AMD also. But compared to Nvidia, Nvidia is doing like 35-40 billion every single quarter on AI GPUs, right? So it's a different ball game. But that's also leaving the door open for AMD to step by step start to gain a little bit of market share. Now, let's control this expectation. I'm not saying that AMD is gonna take 50% market share. I'm probably expecting or hoping that if they manage to solve the connectivity issue that they had currently, we know that on a single chip basis, every single AMD chip is like top notch. You could argue it's actually I would say that the silicon architecture people that are really deep into this would argue that the AMD single chip design is better than Nvidia. That's my, low level understanding of this. But I think the chiplet design that AMD has allows them to do some stuff that Nvidia cannot. And also it allows AMD to tap into the, more advanced node faster. Remember that when you're doing like Nvidia, with these big, huge chips, like, reticle side chips in the multiple hundreds of square millimeters for each chip, like H100, B100, B200 or 300, they are like 800 square millimeters. AMD is doing like connecting 8 smaller chips at around 100 square millimeters each and somehow bonding them together, right? That's the advantage of AMD's design, the chiplet strategy that won the market share in the server area in the server CPU area against Intel in the past 4 or 5 years. Now they're gonna try to do that same thing with Nvidia. Let's see how that holds up. We can also see here, this one is, the CoWoS breakdown in terms of demand from Morgan Stanley, the last one that we got now, a couple of days ago. I would say that based on this one, we still see that Nvidia is like, for 2026, they're expecting to have like 580,000 wafers, right? Then you compare to that number from AMD, that's 59 wafers. Now, accounting for yield and potentially AMD accessing, for example, the higher, like the better nodes essentially with the, higher transistor density, you might say that AMD might have slightly over, maybe just above 10% of the amount of potential output of what Nvidia has next year in 2026. But then again, Nvidia is probably pricing them, the average sales price is much higher, so you have to always account for that. But when you look at all of this and then go to the, the earnings for AMD, I'm expecting that based on the recent news, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD now, let's say Q2 comes in at around 7.5 to 7.7 billion. Remember the guidance they gave was 7.3 or 7.4 plus minus 3 or 400 million, right? That was the guidance from from AMD on the last earnings, 7.4 plus minus 300 million. And they are always, essentially within that kind of guidance. Now, with the news, with the recent news that we got today, the potential easing on the trade limitations when it comes to AI GPU exports from AMD, Nvidia, and so on, I would say Q3 is probably gonna surprise most people on the upside. So I'm actually like, whereas previously, let's say a couple of weeks ago, I started to think about maybe I should reduce my expected revenue for Q3. But now when I'm looking at it again, Q3, we're getting into the high laptop sales and all this kind of stuff. The gaming market is usually much better in Q3 and Q2 and Q1, especially also in Q4 obviously due to the holiday season. But then again, I'm expecting data center to really take off in Q3 for AMD. And based on the latest rumors and news that we got today, I'm actually gonna stick by at least 9 billion for Q3. And I think if the guidance in a couple of weeks from now, maybe to maximum 3 weeks from now on the earnings, if AMD guidance come in anywhere close to like 8.5 or 9 billion, this stock is gonna skyrocket, because at that time they have a clear roadmap to, I mean, more than 10 billion every single quarter in revenue. And this is a very diversified company. They do GPUs, they do CPUs, they're doing GPUs and CPUs in gaming, in embedded. For example, for a lot of you guys that are new to AMD stock, remember that when Elon Musk and Starlink are talking about, you know, all the satellites out there connecting people in the middle of nowhere, there's actually like AMD hardware in there, especially from Xilinx. So the FPGA field program or gate arrays that they purchased from Xilinx, I think like in 2022, they're actually like doing some really fancy stuff when it comes to like these niche applications. For example, space, obviously. And also in the medicine, like, you know, the medicine hardware in those kind of segments, AMD is really big with Xilinx as well. So I think when you look at all of this, it's just like, for me, I would say it's a no-brainer. And also remember that when it comes to analysts, today and over the past week, you have seen multiple analysts from Bank of America and all Morgan Stanley changing their price targets. And this is like what all, if you follow my channel, you know that this is when it comes to AMD specifically, they always do this. When the price goes down, they lower their price target. When it goes up, then afterwards they increase the price target. If there's one guy only you should follow when it comes to like trusting his view on AMD, is Hans Mosesman from Rosenblatt Securities. I've been following AMD stock for almost 10 years now, and I would say that this guy here has always been ahead of the game. Like, so you can see AMD price target is 225, and he actually didn't change it when everyone else started to reduce their price target. He stuck with it, right? So it's still like quite a lot substantially up compared to what the stock closed or is essentially trading out today. Let's see what the stock price is currently. Has a good day, obviously, at 155 almost. So we are almost back to the previous all-time high that was in 2021. But we know that obviously there was a higher all-time high that we had then in March of 2024 at around 200 and maybe 10, 15 on a daily close. But I think on the actually hourly, it was all the way up to 227 or so in February of last year. Yeah, you can see it somewhere here, like 227 actually. Quite happy with that. So yeah, I would say that considering all of this, again, for me, this is a no-brainer. The AI market is not gonna finish anytime soon. You can see that every company out there, the big ones, are gonna continue to spend, especially the likes of the hyperscalers like Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Apple and all these companies, even the likes of, you know, OpenAI and XAI and so on. And then in addition to that, AMD and essentially the rest of the market, they cannot allow Nvidia to run away with this. They simply need at least one other player out there, and that other player is currently looking like to be AMD. And this is something that AMD bulls, and including myself, have been saying for a couple of years. Maybe we were a little bit too early, but I think that we are getting closer to the time frame where AMD actually will show that they mean business. They might not take like 20 or 30% in a couple of years, but I would be really happy in 2028 if AMD had 10 to 15% market share in AI GPU. That would mean multiple tens of billions of revenue for AMD only based on AI GPUs, in addition to the 20 to 25 billion that they had already on all the other segments. And assuming somewhat of a growth on all of those, this could easily be 60, 70 billion, maybe 80 billion revenue every year for AMD. So anyways, this was our update on AMD stock. Please like, subscribe and comment in the comment section. Do you believe that AMD will solve the communication and the connectivity between the, you know, in order to be able to do the tens of thousand clusters that the market is requiring? And see you in the next one.